In today's episode, we're going to attack, how the governments involved conducted World War I because it was new in the scale of warfare. Let's get right to it. World War I, unlike other previous wars, was what's called a total war. Total war was a new concept, and besides the two world wars in the 20th century, it hasn't really been deployed since. Probably because it's difficult and expensive and shifts the entire economy and everyone's lives. In a total war, the entire population is mobilized for the war effort. This means that not only is there most likely conscription or a draft for men of a certain age, but that people who are not drafted pretty much have to reorganize their entire lives around the war. So maybe you're a 50-year-old man who works in a paper mill, and because of your age, you're not really in combat shape. It doesn't matter. Your job at the paper mill has been redirected by the government to where the paper mill is making shavings for use in shipping containers that go to the troops. Or the paper your mill makes is being purchased by the government to use for memos sent between generals. If you're a farmer, your production is tied directly to the war effort. If your crop fails, soldiers don't eat. If you're a housewife, your life has been altered by rationing. Because the Army and the Navy need food, materials, and products, you've been issued a coupon book to where you can only buy so much flour a week, so much coffee, so much meat. Your horse, because not everyone can afford a car in 1915, is not getting new shoes anytime soon because they're needed for a war. Come to think of it, neither are you, because all of that materials is going to boots for the troops. Pencils, even, are difficult to find because those factories have been shifted to produce bullet casings instead of pencils. This type of war requires the population of a country to really buy into the war effort, as you can imagine. I, for example, really like coffee, and I'd be really sad if the government bought all the coffee and so I didn't get any and had to pretend that chicory roots were coffee. So they'd really have to sell why we were involved and why our young men were dying to get me to go along, and they'd also want me to buy war bonds. That famous Uncle Sam cartoon develops because they're trying to get you to join or buy war bonds. So what are war bonds? War bonds are loans that you give the government. You buy a bond, and they give you a certificate promising to pay you back with interest later. This helps fund the war effort. So how do you convince your population to support this level of effort for years on end? Well, you get creative, literally and figuratively. Art, propaganda, and any other form of nationalistic pep is used extensively. Often we see propaganda that vilifies and dehumanizes the enemy. Take this anti-German propaganda poster, for example, where the Germans are shown as basically monsters. He says culture on his club that he's been beating this poor, innocent, and partially unclothed maiden with. These types of posters and messages become more and more important as the war dragged on and more regiments of young men were sent to the trenches. In most countries, censorship boards were created to review media and to make sure that it didn't, quote, undermine the war effort. A lot could actually be construed as undermining the war effort, and so we see the scope of various governments' investigative and policing roles grow. The United States is not immune to this evolution either. They have what's called the Committee on Public Information, and its job is to censor Americans. Colonial troop regiments were amazingly important. For example, more Indian troops died fighting in World War I than American troops did. One famous group of Nepalese soldiers fighting in World War I were called the Gurkhas, and they served in both the Western and the Middle Eastern fronts, losing some 20,000 casualties over the course of the war. Over 1.3 million Indian troops fought in the war, with over 74,000 casualties. According to the BBC, it was Indian Jawans or junior soldiers who stopped the German advance at Ypres, and nearly 700,000 fought the Ottomans in Mesopotamia, meaning that for some soldiers, they were Muslims fighting other Muslims in defense of the British Empire. In return for the money and men raised for the war, India was nominally, as in name only, promised increased self-rule that was largely ignored once the war was over and replaced by the repressive Rowlatt Act. that clamped down on freedom of the press and viciously suppressed any attempts at protesting the wildly unpopular, draconian, and mostly hypocritical post-war treatment of India. In 1919, for example, is something called the Amritsar Massacre, in which troops, led by a man named General Dyer, opened fire on peaceful protesters who were protesting the Rowlatt Acts. Australia and New Zealand troops, here they are, also fought heroically for the British Empire, where the outbreak of hostilities was greeted with great enthusiasm, as it was in many places, weirdly enough. Anzac troops fought throughout the Pacific and heavily in the Middle Eastern campaigns, with especially heavy losses at Churchill's entire hot mess of the campaign at Gallipoli. According to the Australian War Memorial website, World War I remains the most costly war for the Australians. French colonial troops also played a large role in Europe's war. More African colonial troops fought in the French ranks than for any other European power, topping out at some 450,000 North and West Africans. The U.S. World War I Centennial Commission explains how the French riflemen, colonial riflemen seen here, especially from Senegal, were tasked with harassing enemy lines and so were often the first targets of German guns. Germans also forced their colonial subjects in their East African colony into military service, and across the continent, the loss of the men was felt as fields went uncultivated and starvation spread. These colonial troops often served side by side with their European counterparts, fighting for a nation and a sense of freedom. During the war, France and Britain argued that they were fighting tyrannical monarchies for the freedom of democracy. How Russia fit into this, I'm not really sure, but for colonial troops, it was an out-of-body experience. How could they be fighting for their oppressors for someone else's freedom? Many returned home after the war and became leaders of nationalist anti-colonial movements, fighting for their own independence using the rhetoric they learned in the war. Now for the worst part of the episode, the technology and tactics of World War I. World War I saw casualty levels that were utterly unheard of. One of the first major industrial wars was the U.S. Civil War, where new gun technology, like the mini-ball, which was a type of shot, fought against some new medical technology. On the supply side of the war, using rail transport was markedly different than wars before it, and it expanded the scope of the war. Now, in World War I, that new gun technology has shifted from just expanding bullets to machine guns, poison gas deployed to cause mass casualties, airplanes that can expand the scope of the war from the battlefields to the civilian home front without any real warning. Aircraft in particular were absolutely terrifying for everyone, from generals making war plans to prime ministers worried that London would be bombed, which in the next World War it is. So the Western Front is probably the most iconic image we have of the war, where rather than being a war of offensives and capture the castle type plans, it's really more of a war of attrition. Mostly this is because of the new technology. Machine guns mean that your typical move a line of soldiers to where they meet with another line of soldiers battle plan just isn't going to work. The lines of soldiers will just get mowed down. So, to protect from the machine guns, trenches are built. Now, each side hunkers down for what's called this war of attrition, or a war that doesn't really have offensives, and instead waits. It waits painfully for a gradual wearing down of the other side. One of the ways that this attrition could be brought to fruition was through shelling, where an offensive series of explosive charges would be fired at the opposing series of trenches. So let's think about that for a second. So I'm sitting in a trench where it's moist because this area of Flanders is pretty swampy, and my life is miserable because I live in a trench with a bunch of unwashed, wounded guys, and they smell. We all smell. We see blood and mud and guts and bathroom business all day because leaving the trench means getting shot. Also all night, not just all day. So I sit and I write and I read and I wait. And what am I waiting for? I am waiting for something to happen, but whatever happens isn't actually going to be better than this nothing. It's only going to be worse. Death is going to rain from above. I'm sitting miserable, waiting for the telltale thump of a cannon firing and the following screams as it lands home. I'm waiting for it to be my turn. And if it is, there my body will lie, in a ditch, like it did when I was alive. And my friends will be forced to deal with my body, and I with theirs. John Green, in his episode on World War I, talks about the dark poetry of living men waiting to die in ditches that mimic graves. And I just can't really think of something that's more impactful to get at what it meant to be in a trench, right? It's not cutesy, let's throw crunched up paper balls at each other from across the classroom. It's actual dark misery. But there were times when offensive movements had to be made, when soldiers had to go over the top, as it was called, into no man's land. And what they often found were mazes of barbed wire to get tripped up in and gas to choke on. But as usual, the biggest killer was disease. From bacterially infected wounds to fevers to the flu, wartime casualties were exacerbated by the conditions these men lived in and the inability of medicine to deal with them. 16 million people died in the war, but yet 50 million people died of the 1918 flu pandemic. What a brutal way to end a war that so many people consider pointless. So that's our depressing episode on World War I. I personally am glad it's over. Please remember to like and subscribe to stay up to date on everything AP World History.